Have you ever wondered why Africa, a continent so rich in resources, has struggled economically for centuries? Let's turn the pages of history back to the dawn of the 15th century. That was when Western nations, driven by a thirst for knowledge, wealth, and power, first began to explore the African continent. The African landscape was a mystery, an uncharted territory full of promise and danger. What the Western explorers found was a land abundant in resources and populated by diverse cultures and societies. Initial interactions between Westerners and Africans were a complex mix of curiosity, fear, and opportunism. As fascinating as the cultures and natural resources were, it was the human resource that caught the attention of Western powers. The transatlantic slave trade began, marking a dark period in human history. Millions of Africans were forcibly taken from their homes, chained, and transported across the ocean to work in plantations and mines. This trade in human lives was not just a gross violation of human rights, but it also set the stage for future exploitation. The slave trade depleted Africa of its most valuable resource, its people. It disrupted societies, shattered families, and left a trail of pain and suffering that still resonates today. But it did more than that. It established a pattern of economic exploitation that would shape Africa's relationship with the West for centuries to come. The wealth generated from the slave trade fueled the growth of Western economies, while Africa was left impoverished and vulnerable. It created an economic imbalance that would only widen over time. Western nations, drunk on the wealth and power they derived from Africa, began to see the continent not just as a source of slaves, but as a vast territory ripe for exploitation. The seeds of domination were sown with the start of the slave trade and would only grow deeper roots over the centuries. This was just the beginning of a long saga of Western domination over Africa, a story that would unfold with even more complexity and pain in the centuries to come. But how did Africa, a continent of diverse cultures and kingdoms, become divided under Western control? This question takes us back to the late 19th century, a period better known as the Scramble for Africa. A time when the Western powers, driven by their thirst for wealth and influence, carved up the continent into colonies like a pie. It all began with the Industrial Revolution. Europe was hungry for raw materials and new markets, and Africa, rich in resources and untapped potential, was the perfect candidate. Suddenly the continent became a hunting ground for Western powers, all vying for a piece of the African pie. But with so many hands reaching for the same piece, conflicts were inevitable. To prevent a full-blown war, the Western powers decided to sit around a table and divide the continent among themselves. This led to the infamous Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, a diplomatic charade if there ever was one. Here, 14 European countries, along with the United States, formalized the division of Africa. They drew arbitrary lines on maps, creating new countries without any regard for the ethnic, cultural, or linguistic boundaries that had existed for centuries. Ironically, there was not a single African representative present at this conference. Imagine a continent being divided up like a cake, and the people who lived there, the people whose lives would be most affected, had no say in the matter. It was a stark display of the audacity of Western imperialism. In less than a century, Africa, a continent that had been a mosaic of cultures and kingdoms, was transformed into a chessboard of Western colonies. The repercussions of this scramble are still felt today, as the continent continues to grapple with the legacy of colonial division and exploitation. But that's a story for another time. For now, let's remember the Scramble for Africa as a pivotal moment in history, a moment that changed the face of a continent forever. So, what happened to Africa under Western colonial rule? In the heart of the 19th century, Western powers asserted their dominance over the African continent. Colonial rule brought about significant economic, social, and cultural impacts. Beneath the surface of the so-called civilizing mission, the exploitation of Africa's resources and labor was rampant. The economic exploitation was primarily centered around Africa's abundant natural resources. From the gold mines of South Africa to the rubber plantations of Congo, African resources fueled the engines of Western industrialization. The extraction of these resources was often brutal and unregulated, with African laborers toiling under harsh conditions for meager returns. The colonial powers siphoned off Africa's wealth, leaving the continent impoverished and underdeveloped. But the exploitation didn't stop at economics. The social fabric of Africa was also manipulated. Traditional African societies were upended, replaced with Western social structures. The imposition of Western education systems sought to civilize the African population. While this brought literacy to parts of the continent, it also suppressed indigenous knowledge systems and languages. The cultural impact of colonial rule was no less severe. Western powers attempted to replace the diverse tapestry of African cultures with their own. African art, music, and folklore were marginalized, deemed primitive or savage. Western art forms and languages were promoted, leading to a cultural homogenization. Colonial rule also disrupted Africa's political systems. Indigenous political structures were dismantled, and Western-style governance was imposed. While this introduced concepts like democracy and human rights, it also led to a lack of political stability. Post-colonial Africa has grappled with a legacy of political upheaval, largely due to these imposed political systems. Colonial rule was a period of profound change for Africa. But amidst the transformations, the resilience and spirit of the African people remained. They resisted the exploitation, fought for their rights, and strived to protect their cultural heritage. Colonial rule not only exploited Africa's wealth but also attempted to erase its diverse cultural heritage. But Africa, with its enduring spirit, has continued to rise, reclaiming its history and forging its future. But didn't Africa gain independence in the mid-20th century? Yes, it did. The winds of change blew across the African continent during the 1950s and 1960s, marking a significant shift in the global geopolitical landscape. The shackles of direct colonial rule were cast aside as one by one, African nations hoisted their own flags, sang their own national anthems, and charted their own destinies. Yet, as the old saying goes, more things change, more they stay the same. The departure of colonial administrators did not mean the end of Western influence. Instead, it took on a new form, often referred to as Neocolonialism. This term, first coined by Ghana's first president, Kwame Nkrumah, refers to the economic and political control exercised by former colonial powers, even after formal independence. In the economic realm, neocolonialism manifested itself through continued control over key resources. African nations found themselves locked into unfair trade agreements that heavily favored Western powers. Their economies, designed during the colonial period to serve the interests of the colonizers, remained largely extractive. They continued to export raw materials, while importing finished goods from the West, perpetuating a cycle of economic dependence. On the political front, Western powers maintained their influence through strategic alliances with local elites, thereby ensuring that their interests were safeguarded. They provided military and financial aid to regimes that supported their agenda, often turning a blind eye to human rights abuses and corruption. This new form of control, more subtle yet equally insidious, ensured that the West continued to benefit from Africa's wealth, while the majority of the African people remained impoverished. The promise of independence, so eagerly awaited, was overshadowed by the harsh realities of neocolonialism. So, while the mid-20th century did herald a wave of independence across Africa, it also marked the beginning of a new phase of Western domination. Independence brought hope, but the ghost of colonialism continued to haunt Africa. So, where does Africa stand today in the shadow of its colonial past? As the sun rises on a new day, Africa grapples with a multitude of challenges, economic, political, and cultural. These challenges, though contemporary, are deeply rooted in the continent's history of Western domination. Economically, Africa remains a paradox of immense wealth and profound poverty. The continent is replete with valuable resources such as oil, diamonds, and gold, yet many of its people live in abject poverty. This disparity is a grim reminder of the exploitative economic systems imposed during the colonial era, where wealth was extracted for the benefit of the West, leaving the continent underdeveloped and its people impoverished. Politically, the continent is marked by frequent instability, with power struggles and conflicts often tracing their origins to arbitrary borders drawn by colonial powers. These borders disregarded ethnic and cultural identities, sowing seeds of tension that continue to germinate in the form of civil wars and political unrest. Culturally, Africa's rich tapestry of traditions and identities grapples with the lingering effects of cultural imperialism. Many African languages are endangered, while Western languages like English and French dominate in schools and government. And yet, in the face of these challenges, Africa's cultural resilience shines through. Music, art, and literature from the continent resonate globally, reflecting a vibrant cultural renaissance rooted in ancient traditions and contemporary realities. Despite these challenges, it's essential to remember that Africa is not a monolith. Each country, each region, each community has its own unique story of struggle and resilience. The narrative of Africa is not solely one of suffering and hardship. It's also a narrative of resilience, innovation, and a relentless pursuit of self-determination. The scars of history run deep, but Africa continues to strive for a future defined by its own terms, not those of its colonial past. Explore the evolution of the world with GeoEvo World. Subscribe now to stay connected to our ongoing exploration. Exploring the world is understanding its perpetual movement.